Womenopreneurs program organized by the Times of India. Let me take this opportunity to congratulate the women entrepreneurs who've joined this conference today, not just for your countless accomplishments, but for breaking the glass ceiling that we are all, I'm afraid, equally responsible for imposing on the women of this country. Although admittedly, the situation is marginally better in the state of Kerala, which claims, I think, with some justice, to have historically empowered women. We know that women are active members of the state's workforce today, but there are limitations here as well. For instance, in politics, where it's always a struggle for women to achieve the prominence that they have in society. And that's why I mentioned politics, because as I address you virtually, the irony of having a male politician as your keynote speaker is one that is not lost on me. I'm very conscious that I represent a class of our society that has been notorious for the barriers of entry that it has imposed upon women. And in fact, I think this is particularly striking in the current Lok Sabha, for instance. Many celebrated the fact that the 17th Lok Sabha has the highest representation of female members of parliament, but in fact, out of 543 MPs in the Lok Sabha, only 78 elected are women, which is under 15%. Of course, that's better than the previous Lok Sabha, the 16th, which had 65 elected female MPs, or 12.5%. But in a country where at least 48% of our population is female, we ought to be doing better in hearing their voices in our temple of democracy. And in fact, when you look at empowered women, that is, looking at the cabinet, the representation is much worse. At the start of 2020, we only had 3 out of the 24 ministers sworn into the cabinet who were women. Smriti Irani, Nirmala Sitharaman, and Harsimrat Kaur Badal. But she, the last named, Ms. Badal, has resigned, and the number has now come down to just 2. Now, the limitations on women entering the political class are not our subject today, but I mention it because it mirrors a much larger barrier for the entry of women. And that is whether it's in job markets or in positions of leadership within corporates, positions of influence within the government and policy-making circles, or even in terms of how the contributions of women are so often relegated to footnotes when we look at how a nation has progressed. I would argue these barriers are widespread. And we haven't even gotten to an issue that I was involved in a bit of a social media controversy on, which is the value of the unpaid labor by women at home, housewives, homemakers, caregivers at home to their own families. Because, of course, we never factor their labor into the GDP calculations of our country, or of any country for that matter. In fact, the New York Times once had an article saying that if the local minimum wage would be paid to women across the world for the hours they spend in this unpaid labor, or sometimes called shadow labor, it would amount to a staggering $10.9 trillion, which would exceed the combined revenue of the 50 largest companies on the Fortune 500. So we are looking at a large scale injustice worldwide. But women's entrepreneurship, which is what we are discussing today, represents a silver lining amidst these dark clouds. Despite the deep-rooted prevalence of barriers such as the ones I've just highlighted, I do believe that a rising number of women entrepreneurs across the country represents a much-needed and welcome development that we must recognize. Rather than wait for a change at the top in terms of political leadership or official policy making, or even the willingness of traditional workplaces to develop conditions that encourage and enable their active participation, women across the country have taken matters into their own hands and have actively used their entrepreneurial spirit and their own capacity for innovation to become active players in our economy, in our job market. As highlighted in a recent report that was jointly published by the consultancy firm Bain and the tech giant Google, India is now home to somewhere between 13.5 to 15.7 million women-owned enterprises, representing about 20% of all entrepreneurial ventures in our country. In turn, these enterprises collectively employ over 27 million of our fellow Indian citizens. And that figure for employment could rise exponentially higher if the right approach is adopted. The same report, for example, has argued that if a concerted effort is made to promote and grow such enterprises, we could reach a figure of 30 million enterprises by 2030, and that would generate 150 to 170 million jobs in the country, or roughly a fourth of the demand for jobs by our young people by the dawn of the next decade. Now, even as we are encouraged by such figures, we cannot afford to forget certain structural challenges in the field of women entrepreneurship. For instance, take the whole issue of female labor force participation. I raised this in the Lok Sabha just over a year ago. Despite the increase in the population of working age women, female participation in the workforce has actually decreased from 35% in 2005 to 26% in 2018, which is the last year for which I could find figures. And it's likely that the situation has deteriorated even further following the devastating economic impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. Similarly, there are persisting factors that I'm sure the women entrepreneurs listening in are all too conscious of, which directly impacts the growth of their enterprises. And I'll single out three of these factors that I have come across, and I've chaired discussions with women entrepreneurs where I've heard this from the field of action, as it were. The first is, and the obvious one, the difficulties in obtaining external finance. Access to the financing of startups, whether through venture capital or bank loans, remains an enormous challenge for women entrepreneurs. In 2016, a mere 2.5 of all venture capital, 2.5%, not crores, I beg your pardon, a mere 2.5% of all venture capital was invested in female-led businesses. Now, when women partner with male founders, the number increased, but it still remained low at 10%. And my numbers are coming from Fortune magazine. What are the possible reasons? I was looking into this. It seems that women were found to be less likely to seek funding, or that when they sought funding, they were likely to ask for smaller amounts than men. This is not just an Indian problem. In the US, they've actually done studies of this, and they found that women ask an average of $35,000 less per enterprise than men would do for similar enterprises. Women are also offered higher interest rates due to their absence of a good credit history. So if a woman has a poor credit history because she hasn't been a businesswoman before, then the vicious cycle starts that she gets higher interest rates. She has to therefore live with less money, et cetera, et cetera. It just continues. Bankers seem to be judging women entrepreneurs on the basis of their record of performance, whereas men are often judged on the basis of their potential. And this is a kind of double standard that is absolutely unacceptable. The other problem when you look at venture capital is that 93% of the partners in venture capital firms are actually male, and therefore are much more likely to be biased against or unfamiliar with female-led, female-centric businesses. Now, obviously, there are various kinds of solutions that have been attempted, particularly in countries like India. Microfinancing is the obvious one. Microfinancing, the beneficiaries are mainly women. You've got schemes like Kudumbashree in Kerala, where women are out there essentially doing everything themselves, often coming up with their products, making them, selling them, representing them, etc. Crowdfunding platforms, something else that women have tried with some success, niche loan programs, and where possible, venture capital programs that are targeted or led by women. A second big barrier that I've noticed is the archaic social mindsets and cultural practices in our society. There are stereotypes and taboos which are still significant problems for women entrepreneurs. Those that both reinforce our society's norms and in many ways distort women's self-identities and their confidence in being entrepreneurs. Such ideas play out in complex ways. Developing countries often see higher rates of women entrepreneurship due to collectivist norms that accept I'm so sorry, some perceived feminine traits in business contexts. The culture that's coming from the West is that of the ruthless business leader, and the ruthless business leader, by definition, is always male. So the successful entrepreneur stereotype remains that of a man. A woman's role remains apportioned as that of nurturer, caregiver, mother, sister, or employee, and the role of parents and partners in shaping expectations and sharing household burdens remains a real challenge in terms of helping women entrepreneurs to flourish and fulfill their aspirations. The only possible solution to this is more education, more social consciousness, more publicity by media like yourselves, given to those women who have succeeded, who are outstanding examples of women entrepreneurship. There are more Kiran Mazumdar shows, but she seems to be the only one that people hear about enough. And we need to get more of those bits of information out so people feel inspired that our society makes room for women entrepreneurs. And the third barrier that I wanted to talk about is the weak entrepreneurship ecosystems in our country, which often involve giving women limited access to information, to the useful networks they need. There's an underdeveloped entrepreneurial ecosystem catering to women, and access to information and mentorship is truly important. I'm sorry about this, but it's my mother calling, which of course the most important woman in my life. I will have to deal with that after I finish this event. But just to say that that the access to information and mentorship is so vital, but that women unfortunately often do not benefit from this due to male-centered networks, closed networks, low awareness levels, and perhaps lack of information, as I mentioned earlier, about successful women role models. The potential solutions are indeed more training and advice programs for women, more incubators and accelerators that would target women entrepreneurs, as well as strengthening childcare programs and other women-centric policies that will enable women to be able to not feel that they are betraying their responsibilities at home when they go off and attend to education. Now, as a result of these three barriers and many others that perhaps we haven't discussed today, we have to negotiate with the significant industry-based variations in women's enterprises. For example, there's studies that show that women are far more often likely to start businesses in services rather than manufacturing, high-tech, or construction industries, because the latter are considered to require masculine traits, greater technical expertise, or higher levels of capital, or sometimes in all three. So services tend to be considered a more natural fit for women. And these are, again, barriers because you might find very many women who want to do other things, including, of course, manufacturing and construction. Now, despite these circumstances, I believe we can build on the promising results in this field. Women entrepreneurship is a field that we must celebrate, but it's also an area that we will have to collectively do more to develop. It's easy to talk about solutions, but addressing these structural challenges will require greater involvement and commitment from all of us so that we can truly develop conditions that allow our female entrepreneurs to thrive. To the males listening in today, let me conclude with the hope that while we recognize that we're certainly in many ways part of the obstacles I've talked about or have contributed to them, we also have an opportunity to be part of the solution, an opportunity that I hope we will all do our collective best to seize. Thank you very much for these opening remarks to set the context. Jai Hind.